All right. So now uh we'll do a discussion on the body keeps the score. And I'll share not only some of my notes, but my own personal reactions to uh chapters 3 and 4. Now, these are these are probably the most difficult chapters in the book, and that's only because you may not have memorized all the different parts of the brain and what they do. But, you know, this is not an anatomy class. This is not neuropsych. So, you don't have to memorize all the different parts of the brain that it's talking about, but it's good to remember certain ones that play a role in PTSD. Um, so I'm going to try to give you some personal examples as I kind of walk you through uh, the primary parts of this. And the first thing he starts talking about is uh, the giant leap in our understanding of how the mind works psychologically when they came out. First, they came out with PET, the PET scans, and then later MRIs. And so they also came out with CAT scans. Um, One of the things I always wanted to do, uh, now, one time I was in an accident and they did a scan. Uh, I don't know whether it was a CAT scan or an MRI, just to make sure I was okay. And and fortunately I was. And but now with three-dimensional printing, if I find the old disc from that scan, one way it scans your brain is many different slices of your brain, and then it puts it together into a three-dimensional object. Um, so uh, you can actually use the slices in the scan uh, with a 3D printer. And so I always just wanted to 3D print my own skull and sit it on my desk and have it looking at me. Just kind of like this Buddhist reminder of mortality and the impermanence of life, and to like live today, uh, you know, as if it might be your last, and all that good stuff. But, you know, all right, well, that's just my own little thing. But but it not only scans your skull, it'll scan your brain. And um, so if you're using like an MRI, you could actually see it live as you're talking with somebody in the machine. And you can see different parts of your brain being activated, which is kind of cool. And so they had the idea of using this with individuals who are suffering from PTSD. Um, and I think they made some unique discoveries with it. Um, so, you know, uh, when we think about the symptomology of PTSD, um, and the first thing I want to say is that a lot of people who suffer from PTSD are often misdiagnosed. And so people might, if you look at the symptomology, there's of course the more severe things like flashbacks, okay? But there's physical symptomology like a racing heartbeat. There's um, other symptomology which could be misdiagnosed as anxiety, depression, bipolar, um, because a lot of the criteria match. But it's only when you look at the person holistically and take an inventory of their history that if you put everything together, you'll realize this is a result of trauma and PTSD. I can't tell you how many times I've seen patients in the hospital and, you know, they're on like medication for bipolar or depression or anxiety. And as we talk with them and do a more in-depth assessment, we realize that they've experienced some type of trauma. And, these are all symptoms of, PTSD and the result of trauma. So it not only changes the diagnosis, it also changes the treatment. So, I think it's important to do an in-depth assessment and to always consider the possibility of trauma before making a diagnosis. Um, so one of the examples is that they talk about a case where, a mom realized that their child's seatbelt was not fastened, and they reached over to fix it, went through an intersection, got in an accident, and not only did she lose that child in the accident, but also she was pregnant and lost that child as well. Um, and so suffering from that trauma and PTSD, and that's kind of one of the case studies they go with. In another part of our reading, another car accident, a husband and wife, and but they've responded differently to the accident. One responded with a lot of symptomology of PTSD. The other, the wife, responded by kind of disassociating or shutting down and not showing the symptomology, uh, which is actually a different symptomology unto itself. So when we start thinking about the brain, um, it's not just understanding how the brain works, but I think they made some discoveries that changed not only our understanding of how our brains process crisis and trauma, um, but also how it affected how we might treat that trauma as well. And so the first part, the first introduction to the brain is, they give you the three examples of what you see when doing a scan, and you know, uh, the bright spots in the pictures are the limbic brain and the visual cortex, and the brain's speech center shows decreased activation. And so, you know, when we're thinking about, the limbic area, um, we're going to get into a lot of subparts within the limbic area. And the visual cortex is kind of interesting because that really relates to flashbacks. And the speech center actually shuts down, and the limbic area is related to emotions. And, you know, so I think that, uh, and when we're thinking about limbic area, we're also talking about kind of the fight, flight, freeze response as well. So, he has a section called, speechless horror. But what happens when we are in crisis, a lot of other parts of our brain shut down, and the focus is really on the parts of our brain that needs to respond to a possible crisis so that we can survive. And, this goes back a long way back to when, you know, there were, uh, you know, we were living more primitively and responding to life-threatening things like, wild animals and things like that. And so this became part of our instinctual response to life-threatening situations. Um, I think that uh, one of the interesting things that they've been studying, and they don't talk about that in these chapters, but um, I'll talk more in depth when we go over EMDR. But you know, if you think about trauma, um, a lot of times uh, people don't sleep well after a traumatic event, which would be natural, you know. And so we don't enter into REM, rapid eye movement, deep sleep. And uh, one of the things that happens to our brains is not only do we process what happened during the day, we also dream. But uh, one of the primary things is that when we enter deep sleep, we have the REM cycle with our eyes moving back and forth, and um, and uh, cerebral spinal fluid uh, moves up and washes through our brains. So it's not just processing this cognitively or emotionally, there's actually a physical process that occurs while we're sleeping. And so that's one of the theories about how EMDR might help. One of the interesting things I think is the concept of time that the book talks about. And I think it occurs on a number of different levels. I think that, if it's pretty understandable, it's easy to understand if somebody's having a flashback, that that flashback is, so real that they believe it's happening now in the present. And so one of the theories is that um, because people experience, fight, flight, freeze, um, that kind of like activates the amygdala. All of these chemicals, whether it be like cortisol or adrenaline or whatever we need to react quickly to what's happening and escape, um, whether through fighting or running or freezing, hiding, um, you know, but when we think about it, um, if the amygdala kind of gets stuck, it always thinks we're in that fight, flight, fright mode, fight, flight, freeze mode. Uh, and so, you know, if you think about that, what are the physical and emotional reactions to all of those chemicals? Well, anxiety, nervousness, fear, um, you know, uh, uh, never processing the event to a place in our minds that is in the past. So, I think that's a key concept of time and trauma. It's that when people not only experience flashbacks, but anytime, it's not only when they're thinking about the traumatic event, but it's any time they might get startled or maybe hear a scary noise or think they might get in a near miss on the highway or anything that might trigger something similar in some way. It's as if the body responds as if that trauma is still occurring in the present. And so it's a much more severe reaction to, what we call triggers. Um, when when we think about it, um, part of the healing process moves the perception of the trauma from present experience or re-experiencing to the past, where, yes, it was horrible, whatever happened, but it's not happening now. I'm safe now. And so if people feel safe now and that the trauma occurred in the past, we view it differently, emotionally, cognitively, and physically. Um, because right now we're safe. And so it's that processing trauma or healing from trauma uh, actually changes our time perception of the event and how we experience it. Seeing something from a safe position that occurred in the past is very different than re-experiencing as if it's happening now. And we have a different emotional response, a different cognitive response, and a different physical response to that event. And so later he'll talk about how to move something from a present experience or re-experience to a past perception of that experience. Um, so uh, I think, yeah.
Just while it's do you know like what the reaction is kind of like for people whose trauma is something that they committed? So they in the moment were not fight or flight or freeze mode, but like later on you're like more clear-headed where like, oh my god, I committed an atrocity. Kind of like talking at the beginning. Yeah, but without the part where he had actual traumatic event, just like thinking about the acts he then committed afterwards, kind of thing.
So rather than, so you're not asking about a victim, you're asking about a perpetrator?
Yeah, by their actions. Like, think about it.
Yeah. Um, so, I mean, I think it's a different mental process. Uh, I mean, there are similarities. Um, but I also think that there's the concept of guilt, regret, shame, um, and not that everybody doesn't experience these things, even if they're irrational, even if it's not the individual's fault, if they were a victim. But, to a much more realistic degree because it's true, if somebody is a perpetrator rather than a victim. So it's a rational reaction to have regret and guilt and shame and things like that. So um, I think that the closest I can come to an answer would be um, there were different events in different countries in Africa where um, like there was definitely South Africa, with apartheid. Um, and they did go through an organized process where uh, victims would meet their abusers or whatever it was, and um, and the victim would be able to express their emotions and how they suffered, and the person who committed the atrocity, and maybe they were a victim because maybe one of their children were killed or something like that. Um, but it was a reconciliation and healing process. And they did it in another country where um, one tribe committed atrocities against another tribe, but I forget the details of it. Um, and so, like, let me give you one example. So, um, in South Africa, there was a parent, um, and she was a white South African. Her daughter was part of kind of the movement to do away with apartheid, and and she was meeting in a pub, and kind of the rebellion uh, uh, planted a bomb and everybody died in that pub. Well, they didn't know, that she was there or part of you know, the movement for change, you know. But um, it was interesting because, you know, the leader of the movement didn't really ask for forgiveness because so many atrocities had happened to his family members and members of that community. Um, but uh, what they did, they came together and they, had a ceremony and they gave her a title and, um, and I think the title was like uh, Mother of Our Village. And um, you know, so it was a symbolic and metaphorical act that because you lost your child, you now have all of our children. And um, it created healing, through the whole ceremony and everything. And, um, you know, but it's a good question, you know. I don't think the book addresses that side of it. So, one thing I have found is that so many people who commit abuse have also experienced some form of abuse or neglect. Um, and it's not all the time, but the ones I've had in therapy, you know, they have some pretty rough stories themselves. And that's no reason, that's not an excuse, but it does give me understanding, you know, a different perception. Doesn't mean what they did was okay. And they know that, you know. Um, all right. Uh, so, um, one of the interesting things, they talk about sides of the brain. And, they also talk about layers of the brain in development. And so, they use the word kind of reptilian brain, but it's not an accurate uh, name really. Um, but uh, I would say it's one of our earliest parts of the brain that was developed, and then then of course the next part of the brain was like the mammalian, and that's because every mammal has that part of the brain, but not every animal has that part of the brain. Um, so they do begin to talk about different parts of the brain and different sides. So the right is more intuitive and emotional, visual, spatial, and actual. The left is more linguistic, sequential, analytic, while the left half of the brain does all the talking. The right half of the brain carries music of experience. So it is kind of interesting. Um, and when we talk about past memories, it says the left and right sides of the brain also process the imprints of the past in different ways. The left brain remembers facts, statistics, vocabulary. Uh, the right stores memories of sound, touch, smell, the emotions they evoke. And, you know, I think that, uh, you know, when we think about like the limbic system and uh, the thalamus and, you know, everything else, um, even though, they're talking about the brain, um, even if a person goes into denial, it says, but the body continues to keep the score. The body still reacts. And that's where they get the title of this book on page 46. Um, the interesting thing is that if we go from kind of the top down, which is cognitively processing, and they kind of get this top down, bottom up from the parts of the brain. So if we look at trauma from a cognitive perspective rather than a feeling and physical perspective, talking doesn't always work. So kind of the top-down method doesn't always work. Um, and I think that um, when we talk about senses, they've done a lot of studies and on memory and senses. And I learned a lot about the sense of smell through my brother. Um, he he went to like the Pittsburgh Art Institute and always wanted to go into like fashion design. So he moved to New York City and like breaking into fashion's really difficult. But he got involved in like bath and body products and perfume and uh and now he's pretty famous and one of the well-known designers in that industry. His life is very different than mine, but uh I think one of the things I learned was the history of perfume. And most people think that, and I used to think this, like if I'm driving along and I'm listening to a radio and an old song comes on the radio and it brings back all of these memories. And I can remember, maybe the song had some significance with people I cared about a long time ago, or I could remember something I was doing when the song came out. And like there's certain songs I remember spending a summer as a teenager at our municipal town pool, or maybe uh, you know, what I was doing, who I was dating. But so I always thought like seeing a picture, a photograph brings back really clear memories, or listening to music brings back big memories. But um, he told me about all of these studies where uh, the sense of smell brings back the most vivid and experiential memories of all of our senses. And that's because the sense of smell is one of the oldest parts of our brain. And so it categorizes memories related to smells in a more vivid way. So, and I thought about this, and they're right. Um, so I'll give you a couple examples. Like if I am just walking along, like if I'm not going to a certain restaurant, but I smell like, if I smell Indian food, like curry has a really specific smell to it. And it takes me right back to when I was in India for an extended period of time. Um, and it's not just, oh, I remember that from the past. It's a more vivid experiential memory. And it gives me almost like a little re-experience of that, whatever I'm remembering. Another thing would be I don't smell it very much, but when I was a young child, I would watch my mom and dad get ready for like maybe a date night or they had a special dinner or something like that. And neither of them wore expensive cologne or perfume. Like my mom wore one called Charlie, and my dad wore like Old Spice or Brut or something like that. Pretty common ones back then. And if I smell either one of those, perfumes or colognes, I automatically remember that childhood experience of my parents getting ready and, you know, they were all happy. They were getting ready to go out and they were dressing nice um, you know, so if you think about the history of perfume, uh, every culture has their own history of perfume. But if we go to, say, France, um, the, the average person would use spices that they would have around the house. So vanilla would have been a very common thing to use. However, the wealthy people would go to a perfumery, and the only difference between like the three primary grades, perfume has the most amount of essential oils, and cologne has the second amount, and eau de toilette has kind of the least amount. And so you get a stronger smell from a perfume because it has the most essential oils in it. And they'd always put it on parts of their body that would naturally get hotter than other parts of their body. So like the crease in your elbow, you know, if you have your arm like this, it's going to be warmer and it's going to activate the oils. So you'll get a more intense smell. And so they don't like spritz, you know. Um, and so what they would do is they would interview you at perfumery and they would ask, well, what kind of things do you like? And maybe you like riding horses, and that kind of reminds them of the smell of like straw and hay and leather. Or maybe they smoke a pipe or tobacco or something like that. And so they would take all of these things and they would create a unique fragrance for that person, and they would never use that mixture again for anybody else. That would be their signature scent. And the reason they would do that is because they knew about the memory thing. And so if someone was the only person to wear that scent, then anytime they would interact, if they were having a positive event, maybe they went out and did something fun, anytime a person would smell that perfume, they would remember those positive events, and it could only be connected with that one individual. So, and that's why they also call it a signature scent. So anytime you smell it, you could only remember one person. Um, what's that? Kind of, if they had a good time at the event, you know. It would be, right? What did I smell? It had to be that one person, right? It would solve the mystery. That's right. No, I don't wear anything. I am my signature scent, for better or worse. I don't know. Um,
Does he have?
I imagine he does, yeah. But yeah, so he makes like uh lines for famous people and puts their name on it. Um, yeah, like, so he's always sending me like signed copies of stuff from like famous people. Um, so let's see. Yeah, so when we think about our senses, um, and what might remind us of events, it goes both ways. It's not only positive events, it's negative events too. It could be traumatic events. But different parts of our mind react to different senses, to different memories, and things like that. So, um, I bet those of you who are in art therapy liked the next chapter because there's an example of a child who drew a picture of the World Trade Center and people falling or trying to, escape. And um, and the therapist said, "Oh, well, what's that round oval you drew at the bottom?" And the child said, "Well, that's a trampoline so that they'll land safely." And that's kind of how that child is beginning to process these horrific events. And you know, I think it is interesting that today is the anniversary of 9/11. And so people experience these horrific events differently. And so it could be what's called a flashbulb memory. So, for instance, when I first heard that this had happened, I know exactly where I was and what I was doing. And I was teaching at Chatham College back then, um, and somebody had turned on the TV in one of the classrooms to watch what was happening, and uh, and then I went and um, created a place because there were a lot of students who had relatives in New York City, and my brother was living in New York City, and we were all concerned, but there was a safe place where we could go and talk and, you know, um, and share, emotions and kind of do a debriefing until everybody heard from their relatives. And yeah, so um, there's one of the things is that it says being traumatized means continuing to organize your life as if the trauma were still going on, unchanged and immutable as every new encounter or event is contaminated by the past. And that's kind of that time perspective that I'm talking about. Um, and so I'll just read a little bit about what it says. It says, after trauma, the world is experienced with a different nervous system. And that's a result of, how the amygdala responds and gets stuck. And the survivor's energy now becomes focused on suppressing inner chaos at the expense of spontaneous involvement in their life. So, in their life in the present because it's overshadowed by the trauma. And these attempts to maintain control over unbearable physiological reactions can result in a whole range of physical symptoms, including fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, autoimmune diseases. I would say things like blood pressure, racing heart, things like that, anxiety, depression, um, swings of emotion. Uh, this explains why it's critical for trauma treatment to engage the entire organism, body, mind, and brain. And so they're really starting to look at this from a holistic perspective and not to process it as cognitively, uh, but more emotionally. So that's from kind of the bottom of our brain moving up rather than talking cognitively about it moving down. Um, so uh, I think that um, when we look at these different layers of development, I talked about kind of like uh, the the part of our brains that at the top of our spine or brain stem, and you know, and then above the reptilian brain is the limbic system, which is part of the mammalian brain, and you know, um, I think that the top layer, the neocortex is kind of the outer layer. Um, and I think that each one has a function. Um, so the frontal lobes, uh, responsible for the qualities that make us unique within the animal kingdom. They enable us to use language and abstract thought. They give us our ability to absorb and integrate vast amounts of information and attach meaning to it. Frontal lobes allow us to plan and reflect, to imagine and play out future scenarios. They help us to predict what will happen if we take one action. So prediction. Um, so when we think about this, one of the interesting things is that um, empathy is not in the same location as feelings. So feelings is at one of the lower levels of the brain, but empathy is a little different than feeling. Empathy allows us, we imagine ourselves in another person's shoes or situation. We imagine ourselves as the other person. So that takes kind of feelings one step further. It's not what we're experiencing. We imagine ourselves as the other person. And that's why empathy resides in a different part of the brain than feelings that we are experiencing. I just thought that was really interesting because it uses that creative process that's kind of a higher functioning or learning area of the brain than just a, a feeling or an emotional reaction to an event. It uses our imagination and creativity to have empathy. Um, so when we think about all of the different things, so they talk about like, the thalamus is kind of like, okay, where am I going to send this information? Am I going to send it, you know, uh, to the higher part of our brain, to the lower part of our brain? The amygdala, starts telling the brain to produce all types of chemicals so it could respond to an emergency. And, you know, and one of those is adrenaline. Okay. So adrenaline is a really interesting brain chemical, I think. Most people think, oh, it just gives us more energy, but it's so much more than that. So, um, if you've ever seen um, the X-Men, there's one character that can move really fast. Do you know the name of that character? What is it? Okay. So, but what happens when that character moves really fast? It seems like everything else is very slow. Okay. So think about adrenaline like that X-Man character. Adrenaline speeds up everything in our mind, our perception. And it not only gives us a boost of energy, but it speeds up our thought processes as well. So if we think about it in the context of our perception of time, if we're moving faster, it seems like everything else is moving slower. And so I've heard this many times and I've experienced myself. One time I was in a car accident and it really did seem like things were moving in slow motion. So the theory behind this is that adrenaline not only gives you a boost of energy or an ability to focus, but it allows you extra time to react. So even if it's a millisecond, it could save your life. And yeah, and it just reminded me kind of like that X-Men character. Huh?
It's a good scene, man.
Yeah, right, right. He moves everybody around, throws them out the window before the explosion. Exactly. has a piece of pizza. Yeah, yeah. Um, so it also talks about kind of like it gives kind of different names for different parts of the brain so we can kind of get a better understanding of it. So, controlling the stress response, the watchtower. If the amygdala is the smoke detector in the brain, think of the frontal lobes and specifically the medial prefrontal cortex, MPFC, located directly above our eyes as the watchtower, offering a view of the scene from on high, and that part is going to decide, is it a real crisis or am I smelling smoke from not my house, but maybe a bonfire or something like that? So the interesting thing to me about this is that where this is located, and it's located right here. And this is what we tune into. I would even call it, intuition, where we're processing the reality of a threat or an interaction. And if you think about all of these ancient kind of belief systems, some people would call that the third eye, you know. Hindus, that's why they put a mark there, a dot, because it represents the third eye of intuition. And it's like somehow they knew that's where you know, the medial prefrontal cortex was. It's very interesting, I think. Maybe I'm just jumping to conclusions here, or we're following my own line of thought, but it kind of makes sense. Um, and so, you know, uh, as they're looking at these volunteers, which were clients who had experienced trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, and they did scans of all these volunteers, they were beginning to understand how the brain functions. And they didn't say this, but I would say misfunctions because of PTSD. So if we're stuck in that, fight, flight, freeze mode, and we can't get out of it, that's kind of like a misfunction, you know, because we're not able to process that trauma and shut the amygdala off along with the production of all those brain chemicals. And so we continue to have both psychological and physical reactions to the trauma as if it's not over yet. So, you know, I think that, you know, um, it talks about the timekeeper. Uh, so both Stan and Ute had become hypersensitive and irritable after the accident, suggesting that their prefrontal cortex was struggling to maintain control in the face of stress. Stan's flashback precipitated a more extreme reaction. The two white areas in the front of the brain on top of this picture are the right and left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. When those areas are deactivated, people lose their sense of time and become trapped in the moment, as if it's continuing to happen, without a sense of past, present, or future. And that's why it's so difficult to find healing in just talk therapy. Um, and then people were at a loss and they're like, well, I think we've processed this, we've talked about it. The only thing that seems to help is medication. And all that does is sedate, basically. So, uh, but I think, the whole second half of this book is really about new ways to treat, not from the top down, but from the bottom up of our brain, um, through more experiential and physical and emotional rather than cognitive processing. And I think that's ultimately the point of this. Um, so what I would take from this is like, you don't have to memorize every part of the brain, but I would like you to understand what's going on in the brain when we experience trauma, because we have to kind of understand that in order to find healing, you know? So, yeah. So, any thoughts about any of this? Has anybody, looked at this previously or wondering about anything? And I'm not like a neurosurgeon or anything, but yeah.
Because it kind of feels like it's slowing down. You feel like you're not that often.
Uh yeah, I would definitely say, yeah. So so I would say any of those brain chemicals that were created at the time of the trauma most likely intensified our perception at least. And so if you have like um not only adrenaline, but there's probably a big rush of like cortisol, which is a big and all kinds of different things go into that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't really possibly hearing you talk about like on a low made me think of a person I know who actually damaged that section of the head.
Oh
They
yeah.
split their skin open all the way to the skull to the bone. And thinking about it a little bit more like how they process things. And it's like I've seen them with my entire life, never thought about it until I'm thinking about it. I'm like, oh, that might explain a lot that I just didn't think about. I just thought they were cool. I think it was
Yeah, so
unprofessional wordage I could put out there, but
so traumatic brain injuries, absolutely. So that's a whole other area. We have a special course just on that. But theoretically, uh, both Fritz Perls, who came up with Gestalt theory, and Adler, um, they both served as medical doctors in World War One. And separately, they came to the same conclusions that they had to look at both soldiers who were experiencing what they would back then like shell shock. Now we call it PTSD, but they would have to look at them holistically, both emotionally, what they experienced, but also physically, if they had encountered brain damage. So even if there weren't any outer marks, so if there was an explosion, what happens is that there's pressure, but it could also create what's called a contre coup, where your brain bounces off the back of your skull and hits the front of your skull. And that really hits those frontal lobes and can cause brain damage, but there's no physical sign of injury because it all happened inside your skull. And back then they didn't have, MRIs or anything like that. But, those two theorists picked up on that. And that's why Fritz Perls named his theory Gestalt therapy, which is German for holistic therapy. Yeah. How about online? Questions, comments, stories? All right. Well, I'm not the biggest expert on kind of the brain. That wasn't really my field of study, but I did the best I could, and hopefully you got a good picture of the brain functioning and the relationship to PTSD. All right, let me stop recording.